Right, lovely to welcome everybody here today as part of Small Charity Week and to talk about workforce challenges and what's the specific challenges that are facing small charities and what might we do about them. So welcome to everybody. If you do have any sort of technical problems or anything, please drop my colleague Nick a note just on the chat. He's on NCVO Networks and Influencing if you want to drop him a note if you've got any challenges. So for today's webinar, we have 4 panel members who I will introduce to you shortly. But basically by the end of today, we're hoping that you will understand some of the latest data around workforce challenges and what's facing the sector and particularly small charities, understand some of the specific issues, and also ideas around practical ways to try and address these. And when we talk about workforce, we mean both staff and volunteers. So why are we talking about workforce challenges? Well, over the last couple of barometers from the VCSE sector barometers, so the one in March talked about over 50% of charities, so over half of charities having vacancies, and 7 out of 10 charities having recruitment challenges. So nearly 3/4 of all charities saying that they were having challenges around recruiting staff. And then the latest barometer, which was just at the beginning of June, also was looking at volunteering and saying that almost 60% of charities were saying that volunteer recruitment over the past year had been difficult, and over 40% of small charities were considering that volunteer retention was a real concern for their organisation. And then 1 in 6 charities also believing that the well-being of their volunteers has deteriorated over the past year. So that's kind of why we're thinking about workforce challenges, and I'm sure that kind of resonates with many of you on the call today. So in terms of our agenda, I should have said, actually, I'm Laura. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at NCVO. So I'm going to do some housekeeping and some introductions, and then I will pass over to the 4 members of our panel who will all give a short presentation on various aspects around workforce challenges, and then we'll have time at the end for Q&A. Please do, though, put your questions in the questions and answers onto Zoom. So please do that during those, and we'll pick up on those as we go through as well, and then have some time for questions at the end. And then we've got a little bit of signposting towards the end, and then we'll be aiming to finish about 3:30. So just as a reminder, I'm not sure you're all familiar that it's Small Charity Week this week. So just to celebrate and raise the profile of all the great work that small organisations do across the country. This year, we're delighted at NCVO to host it together and partnering with Lloyds Bank Foundation to be able to do that. So I'm hoping that this is probably not your first event of the week and that you're enjoying everything that's going on. So just a few quick bits of housekeeping, if I may. Hopefully all quite familiar. We're all much more familiar with Zoom than we were a couple of years ago, I think. So you will hopefully have noticed that closed captions or subtitles have been enabled. So if you need to use those, then you should be able to use those in Zoom. And you can do that by clicking, there's an icon at the bottom of the screen. If you hover your mouse over it, that will appear, and it's the CC icon. So if you want to have closed captions on, you should be able to do it there. We'll also be sharing, one of my colleagues will be popping in the chat the slide deck that we're using today. So if you do want to download it so you can make the slides bigger or whatever suits you, then please, you should be able to do that from the chat shortly. And on other housekeeping, we hope that you've got a cup of tea, coffee, water, whatever your preference is in hand, because we will be running straight through till 3:30. So, but please, if you do need to get something or step away, then obviously do so. I've already mentioned, but if you've got a question, please pop it in the Q&A function, and do share if you've got, as we're going through the presentations, and if there's things that resonate or you've got tips that you'd like to share with the rest of the audience today, then please just pop them in the chat and share them there. You'll have seen that because we're running this as a webinar, which we're recording through to the Q&A. So we'll record all the presentations, but then we'll stop the recording at that point. But your microphones have been muted at the moment, and sort of videos are off just for the webinar. So please, as I say, post stuff in the chat, or if you've got questions, pop it in the Q&A and we'll pick those up. If we do have any questions at the end that we don't have kind of time to get to, then we will answer them in the follow-up email. So please don't worry that we've not got to your question. We will pick everything up. And then finally, we're not expecting any alarms from where we are today. but actually, you know, if you obviously keep an ear out for wherever you are as well. So just to move on, just before we're going to do a quick poll, but just before we do that, just a quick introduction to NCVO, although I'm sure lots of you are familiar with us. So we're here to support the voluntary sector and volunteering and all of the great work that's happening across England. We have over 17,000 members across the country, and there are a huge range of organisations, from the very, very small community groups right through up to large household names and charities. So a really wide range across all of the country. And we would obviously love more people or more organisations to join us as well. And just to talk about very quickly about the sort of why to join NCVO, there is a huge amount of information that you can access. So both information guidance, downloadable tools and templates. You get discounts with our trusted suppliers and also on all of our own training, our venue hire, etc., as well as keeping up to speed with all of our research. So only members have access to everything we offer. And for small charities, if you have an income of under £30,000, then membership of NCVO is absolutely free. So please do bear that in mind. And then we're just going to do, before I introduce the panelists, we've just got a quick poll, which I think Nick will be launching for me. So just to take a moment about what is the biggest workforce challenge that you're facing at the moment. So if you could take a moment to answer that. So staff recruitment, staff retention, volunteer recruitment, volunteer retention, and wellbeing issues. And I'll just give you a moment to look at that. You can see about half of people have replied so far. So I'll just give it a moment longer. Right. So around 80% of people have replied who are on the webinar today. So coming first within that is 38% saying staff recruitment is the biggest challenge, but that's quite closely followed by 32% saying volunteer recruitment, which I guess depending on the size of your charity and whether you're volunteer led obviously would make a difference. And then after that, staff retention is next at 18%, followed by wellbeing at 9%, and then volunteer retention at 4%. So seems very much like recruitment and staff retention, recruitment of volunteers and staff is at the top of people's agenda as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you on to our four great panelists that we've got today. So first of all will be Amy McGarvey, who's one of our research and insight managers here at NCVO. She will be talking to you about time well spent and some of our new research, which is about volunteer experience. She will then hand on to Helen Toole, who is our volunteering consultant at NCVO, who will be taking some of the things that Amy's talked about and giving you some sort of practical tips for small organisations and what that might mean for you. And then she will hand on to Lucy Hardy, who is the research manager from Charity Job, who will be sharing some hints and tips around staff recruitment. And then finally, Lucy will hand on to Vicky Beavers, who is the CEO of the Sleep Charity and also the co-chair of our small charity advisory panel. So we're delighted to have her here today, and she will be chatting to you about well-being and also how that's been implemented in our own organisation. So I'm going to pass over to Amy.
Thank you so much, Laura. And yeah, it's really great to be here during Small Charities Week to share some of the findings from our latest time well spent research before our official launch next week. So this is a little bit of a preview. As we've got limited time today, I'm just going to literally just drill down to some kind of key findings. And then, as Laura said, Helen will follow with some practical tips about what it all means. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Time Well Spent is our kind of NCVO big research program that looks at people's experiences of volunteering. We had our original report in 2019, and this is our new series in the program, which is based on another large-scale national survey of over 7,000 adults across Great Britain. And this time, we recognise that it's been a very eventful few years, and we really aim to look at what volunteering and what volunteer experience in particular looks like now, especially reflecting on kind of what has and hasn't changed since our original survey in 2019. I should note that this research kind of generally comes from the volunteer perspective, so we can't specifically isolate small charities, but we have a number of proxies, so I'll try and pull out some kind of relevant findings as I go through. And yeah, we'll be launching next week, so we hope to see more of you there. If we could just go on to the next slide, please. So I'll go on to the main findings. So the first of these really looks at the context of volunteering, and our findings highlight the way in which local community very much kind of remains at the heart of a lot of our volunteering. So whether it be where volunteering is carried out, which is primarily in people's local neighbourhoods, over half say that the operating level of the organisation is local, and that's probably one of the nearest proxies to a small organisation that we've got in the survey. And the area or cause the organisation's involved in, as you can see, local community or neighbourhood groups comes out on top there. And we know that during the pandemic in particular, that there was a lot of local-based community activity emerging, especially with the rise of mutual aid groups across the country. Moving on to the next slide, we now look at the kind of places, the spaces that volunteer activities are taking place. And as you can see, when it comes to this, again, community spaces comes out on top, really highlighting the point I just made. But third most common is volunteering online or over the phone, with 31% saying that they did some of their volunteering this way. And actually that's 18% who say that they do it exclusively. Again, it's perhaps unsurprising. We know that so much has shifted away from face-to-face for the period of the time during the pandemic, and that now things are in a kind of much more hybrid space. So whilst kind of that local community is very much at the heart of volunteering, the ways that people engage have diversified a bit more. So moving on to the second finding, and this is really kind of at the heart of the volunteer experience, which is a real focus of our time well spent research. And the kind of headline finding here is that overall satisfaction is really high. So 92% say that they're very or fairly satisfied. And most, just over 3/4, say that they are likely to continue in the next 12 months. And I've just pulled out the figures here for those who volunteer for organisations operating at a local level, which is kind of one of the nearest proxies to a small organisation. And as you can see, it's even higher at 94% for satisfaction and 83% for likelihood to continue. Moving on to the next slide. So alongside the kind of overall satisfaction, we see that volunteers report a huge range of positive impacts on their lives, from enjoyment through to improved mental health and well-being, which is 75% of volunteers, and things like acquisition of new skills and experience. So a whole range of different benefits that volunteers are reporting. And all of these things are very much a kind of testament to volunteer involving organisations who have supported volunteers to kind of feel this range of benefits and impacts. So moving on to the next slide. So we've had the positive news, but there are some challenges raised, and we see that compared with 2019, when we did our original research, satisfaction and likelihood to continue has dipped a little bit, from 96 to 92% for satisfaction and 80% to 77% for likelihood to continue. And some of the groups that we saw in 2019 who've reported slightly lower satisfaction than others still do. So younger volunteers compared with older, public sector volunteers compared with civil society volunteers, disabled compared with non-disabled, and volunteers from ethnic minority communities compared with white volunteers. And on the last of those groups, recognising the importance of understanding this group more, we're going to be doing some dedicated research, which we'll be publishing in the autumn, kind of deep diving into that group in particular. So moving on to the next slide, we see that overall satisfaction has gone down a little bit. And when we look at kind of specifically at some aspects of volunteering, one of the things that stands out to us is that just over a quarter, so 26%, agree that their volunteering is or has become too much like paid work. And also a similar proportion say that the organisation has unreasonable expectations in terms of what they do. And both of these aspects, they've gone up since 2019 from 19% and 17% respectively. And we know from our own research and other evidence that the pandemic in particular did lead to kind of some fatigue and burnout among some volunteers. And we need to recognise and acknowledge some of this and really continue to look out for kind of volunteer wellbeing. So lots to celebrate with high satisfaction, but definitely some challenges raised. The third key finding looks at remote volunteering. So I mentioned earlier that this is increasingly common. And encouragingly, these volunteers we found have a positive experience. So 92% of those who volunteer exclusively by phone or online say that they're very or fairly satisfied, and that's as satisfied as those who don't. And the majority say that they feel supported and that they have a sense of belonging to the organisation. And more generally, if we move to the next slide, volunteers overall say that they're really happy with the flexibility that they're given. So 82% agree with this statement. And when we turn to non-volunteers, so people who haven't volunteered in the last 3 years or haven't never volunteered, the two factors that they say would encourage them most to get involved is around flexibility. And given how positive we see that recent volunteers are about the flexibility, it perhaps kind of indicates that it might be an issue more in perception than in reality. So this seems like a real opportunity to showcase some of the really kind of positive, flexible and remote opportunities that are out there. So moving on to the next finding, so number 4. So we've looked at several things that have changed in the past years, but one of the things that really hasn't is people's core motivations. So despite all of the changes in the outside world, which have impacted on volunteering, the motivation of kind of wanting to make a difference is kind of continues to be what drives volunteers to get involved. And that's both in starting to volunteer, as you can see, and also to continue. But it still has to work practically for people. And if we look at the next slide, one of the kind of aspects that stood out to us in terms of these kind of practical elements is the kind of concerns around the financial impact of volunteering. This has gone up from 5% to 14% among non-volunteers who say that I'd be worried I might end up out of pocket as a barrier to their volunteering. And this is actually even higher amongst younger people. So 18 to 24-year-olds is 18% of those. But on the other hand, if we look on the right-hand side of the slide, we see that practice, a bit about practice. So the organisation would reimburse me for any expenses if I wanted them to. Only just over half say that their organisation would reimburse them. And quite a sizable proportion of 16% say that they don't know if they would. And these are very, very similar to what we saw in 2019. In fact, that 55% is exactly the same. So what it indicates to us is that whilst the context has changed, and we know that the cost of living crisis in particular has really played into this, practice yet hasn't. So the final finding looks around, again, about kind of volunteer recruitment and thinking about those non-volunteers and what would encourage them. We talked about flexibility already, so I just want to focus on the kind of aspects that come after flexibility. We see that if someone asked me to get involved and if I knew about what opportunities were available, are two other things that non-volunteers say would get them involved. So these kind of highlights that there's some proactive ways, and it could just literally be a simple ask to get involved that could help people take that kind of first step back into volunteering for the first time. And finally, just following on from that, we do want to get people in the door, of course, but it's not enough just to do that. And I think what our findings highlight overall, and I've only been able to give a little snapshot of these today, is that these kind of quality volunteer experiences are really important. We know that the main reason that people stop volunteering is actually normally a practical thing around not having enough time with changing circumstances. And we can't really influence those circumstances, really. But we can influence the experiences they have. And it's more likely that if people have a positive volunteer experience, that they'll come back to it when their life allows. So whilst we also might not expect as kind of dramatic changes as we've had before, we do need to kind of keep evolving. And the Vision for Volunteering, which is a 10-year collaborative project, is really helping to kind of help organizations to be future ready. So it's great that there's kind of something actionable and something kind of concrete for organizations to help them move in that direction. So that is just a whistle-stop tour of some of the findings. For those of you who know the kind of time well spent program, there is so much data and it's very hard to kind of drill down to 5. But hopefully that's kind of helpful to understand a little bit more about what the latest findings say. So I'm now going to hand over to Helen, and she's going to talk a little bit about actually putting these learnings into practice. So over to you, Helen.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. Yes, the next few moments are with myself. My name's Helen Turrell. I'm volunteering consultant at NCVO. And what I wanted to do to follow on from what Amy has shared is look in a little more detail at 3 areas from the data that we've just heard about, and talk about how you can use that and put it into practice in the context of a small charity. So Amy has explained to us that via time well spent, we know that being asked to help is a huge driver to new people beginning volunteering. And from our own experiences across the sector, we also know that word of mouth is such a good catalyst for people choosing to volunteer. Time well spent shows us a high level of satisfaction amongst those who do volunteer. And so there's potential here to tap into this as a tool for that word of mouth recruitment and that asking people for help. So you can use your existing staff and volunteers as your recruiters and as your advocates. In doing this, ensure that your people are informed about your volunteering opportunities and how people can go about applying for roles so that they can be that promotional recruiter and advocate for your organisation and volunteering roles there. Do your existing volunteers know what your current volunteer opportunities and gaps are so that they can ask people to help with them? Can you provide your current volunteers with literature, application forms, or information about the online recruitment routes so that they can meaningfully ask the people in their networks to help and support them to get involved as well by providing all that information up front? You might also want to think about how you can take the time to identify and understand the backgrounds and the networks of the people you already have within your organisation, your existing staff and volunteers, so that you can be intentional in terms of recruiting a more diverse range of people. If you know that you have volunteers with connections with particular communities, how can you proactively work with those volunteers and support them to promote your roles? Amy has also explained about how the cost or possibly perceived cost of volunteering is increasingly becoming a significant barrier for those who may want to get involved in volunteering or who aren't currently involved. During the cost of living crisis, this becomes a significant risk to our organisations for people beginning or continuing volunteering. In the first place, you may want to consider developing or possibly renovating your expenses policy to make sure that it's clear, transparent and thoughtful. And you can utilise NCVO guidance in this, and this has been recently updated to reflect the current data and current situation in our country. For example, does your expenses policy consider the peaks and troughs in the disposable income of your volunteer audience on a monthly or a weekly basis? Have you thought about how long is a reasonable time for them to be out of pocket? And can you ensure that your reimbursement process can be completed within that time? Is it easy to complete and ensures that payment can be made in good time? How would you engage your volunteers in what might work for them practically through their week and month? But as Amy said, it's often the perception of being out of pocket for volunteering that has the greater impact for those who are not yet volunteers. So can you make it clear in every advert and in every potential volunteer interaction that you have an expenses policy and that you show your commitment to your volunteers not being out of pocket for the time that they give to your organisation? You can profile volunteers sharing their experiences of claiming expenses, whether that's on social media or in newsletters. It sounds dull, but it can be powerful. Normalising that claiming expenses is part of regular volunteering activities, and it can help reduce that embarrassment of asking for reimbursement, of your volunteers asking for reimbursement, or for those people who might be thinking about volunteering, not wanting to ask that question up front when they apply. And where volunteers don't claim expenses, then asking them proactively if they want to, maybe making it part of your regular supervision or support meetings. Again, those who may previously have not wanted to claim expenses and would rather that cost or that cash stay with the charity, as circumstances change and we all feel the pressure of the cost of living, those people may be in a position where they want to start to make those claims for reimbursement. Making sure that you're proactively asking them, and again giving them that space to make that claim and understand the process that's needed without maybe that sense of discomfort or embarrassment about doing so. And my third area where we can consider practical application of some of the findings that Amy shared earlier. We've heard that the perception that volunteering might be inflexible can be a barrier in recruitment, but in reality, volunteers are telling us that that's not often the case, with many volunteers reporting flexibility within their roles. So we can bust that myth to support our recruitment of volunteers. So firstly, how can we make our volunteer roles more flexible in practice? This should be an active and an ongoing exercise in our organisations. Where are the opportunities to bake flexibility into our roles and into our volunteering programmes? It isn't always possible against the operational needs of our services and our activities, but unless we think about it, we might never know. Can a role be done online? Do we really need a regular time commitment? Do we need to state that regular time commitment up front? Can we arrange for people to role share? Can we provide structured breaks or opportunities for people to step away or step back or go on pause within our roles? Can we create opportunities for people to volunteer as a family or as a group of friends? As Time Well Spent showed us, a lot of people or a proportion of people would be more inclined to start volunteering if it was something they could do with their family and friends. And then once we've done this, how can we showcase and share it? Can we share case studies of volunteers who can talk about their experience of volunteering flexibly, again, via whatever channels we tend to use, social media, print, newsletters, and that word of mouth experience that I mentioned earlier as well. How can we talk about this in our recruitment materials and our other advertising as well, where we talk about the activities of our organisation in our communities? Oh, and I will pass over to Lucy very shortly, but I think that the golden thread in this, just to sum up, so many of you said in the poll at the beginning that recruitment feels like your bigger challenge at the moment than maybe volunteer retention. And I think this is really interesting because good retention, as we've said, makes for good recruitment. So putting all these things in place gives your volunteers that positive experience. We can't stop them stepping away if their circumstances change, and we know that that's the single biggest reason why people do stop volunteering. But we can give them that positive experience, so they're likely to recommend, to suggest, to pass on that word of mouth in order to aid our recruitment practices. So I see recruitment and retention going hand in hand. And if we can bake in these positive experiences and this flexibility, then that can really pay us dividends in terms of recruitment long term. And now I will hand over to Lucy.
Thank you, Helen.
Slide, please. There you go. Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. My name is Lucy and I am Research Manager at Charity Job. So I'm going to talk about a few specific recruitment challenges for small charities, and then I'll share some research-based tips for attracting and retaining talent, focusing on how you can create a fair and candidate-approved application experience and how you can attract talent. So this is going to be a bit of a high-level whistle-stop tour, but if you are interested in finding out more on any of the points, I have linked extra resources on the slides, or you're welcome to get in touch with me after this webinar. So the first challenge that I wanted to talk about, if you just go on to the next slide, please, was the candidate-driven market. So in 2022 in particular, the UK experienced a candidate-driven market where there were more job vacancies than candidates available to fill them. So we saw this in our own data with a 35% increase in jobs posted last year on our site compared to 2019. And at the same time, we saw a 13% decrease in demand from candidates, which was measured by the clicks that jobs get on the apply button. So these trends weren't unique to the charity sector. Recruitment challenges were faced within all sectors in the UK. And looking at our data from the first quarter of 2023, we are beginning to see signs that the recruitment market is starting to stabilise. However, we are still in a competitive and challenging recruitment market, which means charities need to work harder to recruit. And the other main recruitment challenge for charities that I wanted to touch on, and this is especially for small charities in this time, is how to stay competitive in the cost of living crisis. So research by ONS has actually found that around 1 in 5 adults are currently looking for a new job that pays more due to increases in costs. And here is a snippet from Charity Job's recent salary report, which uses data based on all jobs posted on our site in 2022. So here are the average salaries for the most common job categories on our site, so for 2019 and 2022. And whilst these categories have seen modest increases in salaries since 2019, they are failing to keep up with the high rate of inflation. And small charities in particular are likely to struggle here, as in general, small charities pay less than medium and larger sized charities. So I just want to note that I will be going on to give some tips on how you can attract candidates if you're struggling to offer those competitive salaries in a few minutes. But now I'm going to move on to some tips to help you attract and retain talent. And first, I'm going to be sharing some insights from our candidate research and translating this into advice on how you can create a fair and candidate approved application experience. So my first recommendation is to focus your job requirements on essential skills for the role rather than a candidate's background. So by background, I mean things like years of experience and education requirements. And there are a few reasons why this is really important. So firstly, huge reviews of research have found that both the amount of experience and someone's level of education are actually really poor predictors of job performance. And secondly, research also shows that people such as women are unlikely to apply for jobs where they don't meet 100% of the job criteria. So if they don't have that exact experience you put as desirable on your job description, even if they'd actually be a great fit for the role, they are less likely to apply. So they will reduce your pool of candidates. And what's more is that including requirements like a degree for jobs where it's not truly necessary may create or reinforce inequalities in your organisation. So instead, you should focus on the skills which are required and the level of experience required. My second recommendation is to avoid using application forms for jobs. So at the end of last year, we asked our candidates about their pain points in the recruitment process. And we actually found that having to complete long application forms was the most commonly reported pain point, which was followed by not hearing back from employers about job applications. And we also know from our own data that jobs posted on our site, which require candidates to complete an application form, get only 1/3 of the applications of jobs which don't require completing an application form. So not only are application forms frustrating, they will actively stop people from applying for your roles and will greatly reduce the size of your candidate pool. So instead, we highly recommend using screening questions with a CV to recruit. You could just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we do understand that some charities use application forms for reasons like they might feel that a CV doesn't always include the information they need, or because application forms ask consistent questions. So if you are struggling to make the move away from application forms, we recommend that you try using the screening questions with CVs and anonymous recruitment. And these can be used in many ways. So for example, to assess eligibility, skill set, etc. So there are a few examples on this slide, but I've also linked a blog with more information on how you can use them effectively. We also know that charities use application forms because they can be easily anonymised, and therefore they can help to reduce bias in the first stage of the recruitment process. And this is a valuable reasoning. We know that CVs aren't immune to bias, and actually a significant amount of research has shown that applicants with ethnic minority names are discriminated against when applying for jobs, and they do worse than those with ethnic majority names. So we really recommend using anonymous recruitment. So on Charity Job, for example, this will hide the names of candidates and give them a pseudonym instead on your CVs and applications to help you remove the fog of bias in that shortlisting stage. And as I mentioned before, the second most common pain point of our candidates is not hearing back from employers about job applications. But getting back to candidates isn't just the right thing to do. So in this current challenging recruitment market, it's really important to focus on your brand offerings and your application experience if you do want to recruit. And we ask candidates whether they'd be likely to apply for a job in future if an organisation ignored their application. And a massive 79% of those we surveyed said they'd be less likely to apply to an organisation again if they hadn't had a response to a previous job application. So this is huge, and it just goes to show the impact a poor candidate experience can have. So now I'm going to talk about our research on what candidates are looking for in their next roles and how small charities can attract candidates in this tough recruitment market. So as I mentioned earlier, in the current cost of living crisis, pay is becoming more important to candidates. So 9 in 10 of our candidates see the salary for a role as either important or very important, and offering fair and competitive salary does play a significant role in attracting talent and also to help level the playing field to encourage those from diverse backgrounds to apply by removing potential barriers that may disproportionately affect underrepresented people. And you can use Charity Job's free salary checker tool to help you benchmark your salaries, and this is available to anyone with a recruiter account. But obviously, offering competitive salaries can be challenging for some small charities. And for Charity Job candidates, a fulfilling and meaningful job is about more than just a pay packet. You can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as I mentioned, around 9 in 10 of our respondents see the salary as either important or very important. But what's interesting is that respondents are similarly as likely to view organisation culture and organisation mission and purpose as key factors in their considerations of jobs. So candidates really want to work for a cause they're passionate about in a positive working environment. So you should really sell your mission and organisation cause in your job descriptions and be clear on the impact that the role you're advertising has in helping to achieve that mission. And you should also be very clear on the organisation culture, as this is something very important to many candidates. Additionally, you should emphasise any flexible, hybrid and remote working that you can offer. So in 2022, remote roles on our site got around 6 times more clicks and apply than on-site jobs, and hybrid roles were twice as popular. So if you can offer your role as remote or hybrid, you will greatly increase your candidate pool. And lastly, you should sell the benefits that you're able to offer. So from our research, these are the top 5 benefits or perks that are most in demand by Charity Job candidates. So the first was 25 days or more annual leave. That was followed by flexible working hours, then remote working options, training and development opportunities. And finally, there was quite a high demand for the 4-day work week on full-time pay. And what we also found is that more of our charity sector candidates, so those who are already working in the charity sector, receive these benefits than candidates who aren't currently working in the charity sector. So we know it's a massive selling point for the sector, and you really should emphasise these on your job descriptions. So on the next slide, I've just got a couple of summary points which you can come back to at any point. I won't read them out now. But yeah, thank you all so much for listening, and I will hand over to Vicky, who I believe is going to talk about wellbeing.
Thanks, Lucy. That was really insightful and particularly useful for me because I'm a CEO of a small charity, and certainly recruitment is a real difficulty at the moment. So thanks for that. So welcome everyone. As I just outlined, I am a leader of a small charity, and I'm a leader with lived experience, which basically means that I set a charity up based on my experience of suffering sleep issues. And I will be completely honest, I understood very little about how voluntary organisations ran back then, or how difficult it is to be a small charity and not just to thrive, but just to survive. So my presentation is based on my learning and the journey that I've been on over the last decade. And as it says on here, I'm also really proud to be co-chair of the Small Charities Advisory Panel, and you can find out more about our work on the NCBO website. So in terms of supporting wellbeing, I think when I started the Sleep Charity, which is a small national organisation now, I was really focused on how I could support our beneficiaries, and I never thought about looking after myself and we were voluntary led when this set up. And perhaps I didn't think in too much detail about looking after the volunteers either, although I will say I know that I looked after their well-being better than I looked after my own, which is why I've put right at the very beginning that looking after you is really important. Modelling the behaviours that we want to see to ourselves is incredibly important. And sometimes I reflect on how I would support a staff member or a volunteer, and actually am I offering myself that same support, because we need it in order to thrive and so that we can carry on doing the important work that we're all doing. I've also found along this journey that it can be a really lonely job at times. So leading a small organisation can be really stressful. So I don't need to tell many of you, there's the stresses around managing teams, around finding funding, and also around working with those that we are serving to support. And one of the things that I have found particularly helpful for my well-being is establishing connections with other small charity leaders. So I've got a sort of team of people around me who I will call for information, for advice, but also just for a chat. And that's really important to keep those social networks going. And when it comes to well-being, staff and our volunteers are our greatest asset. So supporting their well-being is an excellent investment. And I know that funding is tight, money is really tight at the moment, but we can't afford not to look after our teams. A part of this is around creating a culture of support, a culture of openness. And I wasn't quite sure how to go around this. And I did buy in some consultancy support to do that. But I also went to Reach Volunteering. And if you've not been on the website, I really strongly suggest you go, because it is full of really highly skilled individuals who want to support and help small charities. So I was fortunate enough to find a volunteer on there who was able to work alongside me and develop a workplace culture strategy so that we could start to make real positive changes. And I also reflect back on using the oxygen mask analogy. So actually, we've got to put our own oxygen masks on first so that we can support our teams and also support our beneficiaries. So it's not selfish to be looking after our own well-being. It's absolutely vitally important. So what do we do? And I'm not saying that this is perfect, and it's certainly an ongoing learning curve for us. But all of our staff and volunteers have supervision. And this takes place at least once every 6 weeks. And this is absolutely key. So it's a point where they can touch base with the person that is line managing them. But a big part of our supervision is around well-being. So it's about asking, how are you? What's going on for you right now? Not just at work, but also finding out what's happening at home. Is there anything where staff or volunteers may need support? It's having these honest conversations so that staff feel really supported. We also tailor support based on supervisions to meet individual needs. So we will look at doing things like, we've offered things like counselling, or if there's been issues around public speaking, for example, we've been able to identify that this may be causing some stress and to address what we need to do around that, whether that be shadow other members of the team who are really confident in that area, whether it may be developing skills in that area by buying in additional support from an outside organisation, or whether it be actually seeing if anyone else can take on that role if it's causing stress. We also provide a healthcare plan, and we found that this is a really cost-effective way of offering support. So within that, our team can claim back things like the cost of their eye tests, but they also can claim for private medical consultation, and it is not as expensive as I thought it was going to be. It's actually saved us some money as well around the eye test issue, and it helps the team to feel really valued. We have a health and workplace wellbeing champion, which is taken by our deputy CEO. And she's trained by Mental Health First Aid England as well. And she's recently trained as a menopause champion too. So the staff know all about her role, and this is added to every staff meeting. So just as a reminder that actually if they do have any health or wellbeing problems, that they can go to her. I think I've just lost my slides, so let me just check with my paper copy. Okay. We also offer flexible working, and that's important because actually reflecting back on my own work, I remember I was a teacher before I came into the sector. I wasn't able to attend my son's first day at school. That's something that still breaks my heart. But what we do is we offer flexible working so that staff can speak with us if they've got things they need to get to, then they can absolutely get there. That's key, and it makes them feel valued, it makes them feel supported. So I always say to the new members of our team who come in as parents, don't worry about missing the Christmas productions, because you are absolutely going to them, because this is really important. Family life is important too. Okay, so next slide, please. And you can hear as part of the flexible working, I'm working at home with my dog's barking in the background because I think someone's at the door, which is perfect timing, but so I do apologise for that. We have an open doors policy, so people don't have to wait for supervision if there's a problem. They can contact the line manager anytime, and they can contact me at any time as well. They also have my home number. It's important that people aren't sitting there with worries, that they know that they can come and speak to somebody straight away. We also do things like walking meetings. So we know that people are stuck behind the desks for long periods. Let's go for a walk and chat about different things so that we're out in nature and having that social interaction that can sometimes be missed. Another thing that we started during lockdown and we've continued because our team is spread across the country is a virtual tea room. So that takes place every Wednesday, and our trustees drop into that as well. And it's literally, if you're around and you're free, drop in and have a social chit chat and just catch up, see what's happening with the rest of your team. We really try to promote regular communication, and we have had active listening training for the whole team as well. We do weekly check-ins whereby everybody does a to-do list and it's sent round at the end of the week. But also on our to-do list for the next week and the reflection about the past week, we include little snapshots of what's happening at home. So we're all following at the moment the training progress of our head of sleep supports dog, who is going to be a guide dog. So that's really interesting. And we're all very invested in Buddy. We also have a monthly newsletter that is just for the team. And again, we celebrate individual achievements in there and also share news. And it's really high quality when you look at it. So when people receive it, it is of some value. It's not just sort of typed out. We do have it professionally designed by our graphic designer. We have an annual survey for staff, which is anonymous. It goes directly to the trustees. And within that survey, they can feedback around things like how valued they feel, how they're feeling about working for the sleep charity, and they can suggest any improvements that they would like us to make as well. We promote team building heavily, and again, this is something that I didn't used to do because it seemed a bit extravagant, but actually it's really important. So we are going alpaca walking next week. We've done things like team building with the board, escape rooms. We do it both online and face-to-face. There's some great packages that I've been able to purchase online to play some games. We've done virtual duck racing as an example. And we celebrate individual achievement, whether that be achievement within the workplace or whether that be achievement in home life. That's really important to have like a positive around the work that we're doing and to celebrate the amount of effort that everybody puts in and to appreciate each other. So that is my whistle stop presentation. I'm sure there's lots more we do as well. And I hope that's been helpful.
That's great. Thank you, Vicky, and thank you to all of our other speakers as well. So we're going to move to a bit of a Q&A now. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A already, and I have some other questions that I will put to some of our panelists as well, but please do add to the Q&A if you've got anything else that you would like to ask. That would be great. So I'm going to start with the two that are there and then come on to others. So these are both for you, Lucy. So hopefully you can still hear me. And I think just before we do that, sorry, Nick, I think we're going to stop recording at this point for the Q&A. I think that's right. And so